Well, thank you very much. Good to follow on after that opening session. I'm a professor of early education, and for a long time I've been involved in childcare issues for the EU and for the OECD, but also in low-income and middle-income countries. And in particular, in my recent research, I've been looking at the role of the private market in childcare and the extent to which it perpetuates inequalities. So I've got a real interest in this area. We're here today to talk about the report that ODI have produced on women's work. It's an absolutely terrific report, and it also follows hard on the heels of the UN Women's Policy Brief on childcare and early child development. So hopefully, from being an invisible area, it's now becoming a hot topic. And so it should be, really, since I imagine most of us here have had to face the problem of childcare, also grandparent care. So I'm very pleased to introduce the report and our panel of speakers. This morning we're going to be exploring who's caring for children across the world, the type of care available, and the impacts on women who disproportionately make up the care economy. We know that labour force participation of women has been rising in the wake of rising female education levels and lower fertility. And rapid urbanisation in many parts of the developing world has led more women to take jobs in the formal sector, where there are often fewer options for combining employment and care. And mothers are just caught in a real bind about leaving their children behind. In the most extreme cases, if the mothers are immigrant workers, as, for example, there's been a lot of studies of women in the Philippines who are nannies in the rich world, leaving their children behind in the poor world. So we have a childcare stat slide here. We should have. Have we? Right, in which reports a survey, hopefully one that meets evidence-based policy standards, a survey in Kenya, Mozambique, Liberia and Senegal, and 60% of women surveyed as part of the UN World Survey conducted by ODI cited a lack of childcare as the primary factor in preventing them from working. So that's what we're dealing with in this panel. Let me give a warm welcome to our expert panellists. Nicola Jones, whose work I've admired for a long time, who's a senior research fellow at ODI and co-director of the Global Girls Research Initiative. Jenny Chapman, who's Labour MP for Darlington and newly appointed Shadow Childcare Minister. We'll be watching you very keenly. Unfortunately, Mridula Bajaj, who's the chief executive of Mobile Creches, a rather wonderful Indian charity providing childcare facilities, can't be with us today. So we're going to look at a video of the work of the organisation. And we have Nikki van der Haag, who's an independent consultant on gender in development. And she recently co-authored the State of the World Fathers report and is the author of a recent book titled Feminism and Men. So without further ado, let me introduce Nicola. And if I could remind you all, you've got an impossible task, which is to make your pitch in 5 minutes. So.
Do we have the slide? Sorry, this one, just in front of you.
This?
No.
Oh,
sorry.
Yes.
Couldn't think of the word. Okay, thank you very much. So the title of our report is Women's Work, Mothers, Children and the Global Childcare Crisis. And in writing the report, we really set out with 3 key objectives. We wanted to bring together existent research to identify patterns and gaps in the care that children receive in the global north and south. We wanted to identify the common costs that girls and women as primary caregivers are shouldering, and then also to ascertain where and how policy is helping women meet their care responsibilities and where it's falling short. So the study methodology, it involved 3 different components. First of all, the quantitative data work pulled together data from a wide variety of sources, including global time use surveys, demographic and health surveys, and UNICEF's multi-indicator cluster initiatives looking at women and children's rights fulfillment globally. We then complemented these large data sets with 3 in-depth qualitative case studies, one in Vietnam, which looked at grandmothers raising their grandchildren, one in Gaza, Palestine, which looked at the care responsibilities of mothers of children living with disabilities, and then also a 3rd case study in Ethiopia, where we looked primarily at migrant adolescent girls and the role that they play in providing paid childcare. And we also undertook a couple of rapid case studies of India's mobile creche scheme, which we'll hear more about later, and also the role of Bolivian migrant women and their role as carers in Spain. So just to highlight some of the key statistics that emerged from the research. Firstly, our research revealed that women are often trapped between, as Helen's been highlighting, 2 competing demands: providing the minute-by-minute supervision and care that young children require on the one hand, and then earning a necessary income to keep them fed and clothed. So as a result, across 53 countries, we found that more than 35.5 million children aged 0 to 4 are being left at home alone at least once a week. And our estimates are that globally, this figure is likely to be greatly underreporting, as those 53 countries represent just 20% of the globe's population. And unsurprisingly, again, pulling on the themes of inequality discussed in the previous panel, poor women are far more likely to be forced to leave their children home alone than non-poor women. So up to 70% of under 5s at home alone are from the poorest families in the poorest countries. Time pressures on women as a result of their heavy responsibility for childcare and other unpaid work can be excessive. On average, time use data shows that women spend up to 5 hours on average more than men each day on unpaid childcare and other domestic work. So at the extreme end of the scale is Iraq, which is the most unequal in terms of women and men's time inputs. We found that Iraqi women spend 10 weeks per year more than men on all things related to running a family. Not surprisingly, Scandinavian countries are the most equal, but even here the load is unbalanced, with women spending 1 to 2 weeks on average per year more than men on domestic work and childcare. I think it's also important to highlight that around the world, grandmothers are taking on a large share of this childcare, effectively parenting their grandchildren. And so in sub-Saharan Africa, particularly in southern Africa, this has resulted in particular from the HIV and AIDS crisis. But in other countries, as we've heard from previous speakers, it's the result of the mass migration of parents who are taking on urban jobs to support their families. So in China, the estimate is that some 61 million children are being left behind with grandparents. And our own research with grandmothers in the Mekong Delta in Vietnam, we found that grandmothers were often caring for large numbers of children because several of their own children migrated, and they were then left caring for multiple sets of siblings. We found that because the parents' urban jobs were almost universally poorly paid, remittances were very low and irregular, and grandmothers were often extremely poor. And so this quote just highlights the desperation that some of the grandmothers in our study were facing. We also found that some were very anxious that they lacked the skills needed to parent this new Facebook generation. The other group that often do not receive enough attention in these debates about childcare and women's burden are adolescent girls, and particularly those from the largest and poorest families are often drafted into care work to reduce demands on mothers' time. So in Ethiopia, for example, this results in girls missing school, On average, across a school year, girls without siblings were absent for 10 years, girls with 5 younger siblings for 10 days, girls with 5 younger siblings for 21 days, and those with 7 younger siblings missing up to 49 days. So it's exponential in terms of the number of siblings. In our work in Gaza, we found that older sisters are often key to helping mothers juggle the extreme care needs of children with disabilities in the absence of adequate public services. So this impacted these girls' ability to rest and to socialize, but also prevented them from adequately focusing on their schoolwork, and this is then reflected in the gender gap in higher level exams. So our report concludes that in a world of finite resources, it's really crucial to design policy and implement programs that leverages the largest impacts by meeting multiple goals at once. And so we focus on 6 key priority areas that policymakers should consider. First, there's a real need to extend and implement care-related labor market policies like maternity and paternity leave to enable parents to better combine work and care and to foster pay parity. Secondly, we emphasize that it's critical to promote an integrated, multi-generation approach to social protection that's sensitive to care responsibilities. So programs really need to start thinking about recognizing families' needs more holistically and to include links to subsidized childcare, to allow mothers to work, stipends for older sisters to reduce incentives to remove them from school, and pensions for the grandmothers who are often providing primary care. Thirdly, there's a need to promote universal early childcare and education programs, but also to ensure that there's adequate funding for these programs. There's a big push to have a universal expansion of early childcare programming, but very little budgeting is going into that. And in cases like Ethiopia, we're finding that they're relying on the unpaid labor of adolescent children to deliver these goals. And then finally, we need to include men and boys in these caregiving agendas by working through schools and community-based organization to promote new roles of masculinity that helps brothers share their sisters' care burdens and fathers see themselves as central to the children's development.
Thank you. Brilliantly concise. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce Jenny Chapman, MP, who's the Shadow Childcare Minister. And Jenny, I'd like to start by asking you to explain, or should I ask you this? Yes, to explain the state of childcare provision in the UK at the moment, and then perhaps make some comparisons with what Nicola has said. I mean, are there any lessons to be learned from what's going on in the UK?
Well, I think, first of all, just thank you for inviting me. Normally at these events I feel completely intimidated because obviously I am a lay person and I'm surrounded by people who've spent their careers investigating a particular topic, so I come here with that very much at the front of my mind. As far as the state of childcare in the UK is concerned, it's really difficult to read the report that was produced on Friday and not reflect on the fact that actually, if you're a mother in the UK, you are in a pretty fortunate position when compared to some of the circumstances that we see women enduring in other parts of the world. Having said that, we do face our own challenges too. And my job is to support the Labour Party in formulating its policy position on childcare and early education and support for young families leading up to the 2020 general election. So actually this is a very good time for me to be hearing the debate and to listening to experts and leading thinkers in that field, because the very clear steer from Jeremy Corbyn is that we want to provide a universal offer in England, because obviously post-devolution it is only England that I'm responsible for, but that really does provide a much clearer support for parents. And the reason that he wants to do that is because it's 2 reasons. The first is maternal employment. and all the evidence shows that where you can provide predictable childcare that is affordable or free for parents, that they will use it, and use it to access the employment market, but also reasons of social mobility. And we are very, if there's something that, why does the Labour Party exist? It is about social mobility and providing opportunity to as widely as we possibly can. And we are particularly interested in supporting women from less advantaged backgrounds. I found the exchange during Hella's questions about elite women not being particularly representative. I find that very interesting, and that's something that's been on my mind for a while. And I think that we do need to encourage women from all backgrounds to enter employment, to use maybe that time post-childbirth to review their skills, review their opportunities, and they get precious little support in doing that at the moment. So that's something that we're interested in too. My own view is that the debate around childcare in the UK has become really quite dull and dry and all about hours, and this sort of auction you've had between the parties around, we'll give you 25 hours a week for free, we'll give you 30 hours a week for free. And I think we need to use the time that we now have to really think about why we do this, why we want to provide additional support for parents in the form of childcare. There are limited resources, so how should that be targeted? And if our aims are maternal employment and social mobility, oughtn't we be looking at perhaps earlier on in a child's life? At the moment, the free offer is, for most 3 and 4 year olds, is there an opportunity to support women at a younger age? The conversation around grandparents, I think, that's starting to emerge is fascinating. I was just texting my mum before I got up to speak to see if she could collect my boys from school tomorrow. And I think, the role of grandparents, it's great that this is starting to really be at the foreground, because they really are the sort of hidden army of childcare support, because they're flexible and often exploited shamelessly by their offspring. But I think that, were it not for that, women's ability to take on different jobs, longer hours jobs, shift work that we often need to do would be extremely limited. The only other thing that I would like to say really is that it's just so good that childcare now is at the centre of political debate. I can remember in the 90s it really being quite a niche issue of sort of a few quite seen as fairly sort of stroppy Labour women like Harriet Harman and Margaret Hodge and Tessa, did a great job getting it on the centre of the political debate. But now it is mainstream. It is seen as it's there with transport, with health, with education. It's a key political issue, and I think that's a good thing. The direction of travel is all about more, better quality, extending availability. And I think that's a good thing too, because we have some very real challenges around availability, particularly in some parts of the country, certainly around affordability. The new initiatives that the government's bringing in around 30 hours, I think, are insufficient and won't be delivered for the parents that we want to benefit. So there's challenges. The direction of travel is the right one, and it is getting the attention that I think it has deserved for a long time. So, I hesitate to be too optimistic in front of this audience. I'm sure you're all about to tell me how disastrous it all is. But at least on a UK level, I think we are starting to move in the right direction.
Okay, thank you very much. Very, very briefly, do you have any views about the type of childcare provision that's available? Because the UK's quite unusual in having 80% of its childcare provision in the private sector.
Yes, I think that it is a strength that we have a market for childcare and that there is choice. What troubles me is that sometimes the choice isn't determined by what is best for your child or your family, and it is around, you know, what happens to be available in your local area. We are seeing a declining number of childminders, and I think particularly for younger children, and particularly for parents who really need that flexibility, who may have older kids too, so they're picking up from school, they need early hours. You know, childminders are crucial to the support that we need to provide. My fear is that what we're going to see is a kind of consolidation in the market because of the way the government's been playing with the funding mechanisms. And I don't want to see happening in childcare what I think has been happening in older people's care, where you get, you know, real downward pressure on pay and on quality. And I think that we need to be quite clear that we want diversity. So the fact that there's a large percentage of private providers isn't in itself a problem, as long as we can assure ourselves that the range, the availability for women and for parents is what it needs to be, you know, across the country. And at the moment, you know, that isn't the case.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there'll be questions later. Yeah. Okay, I wonder if we could move on to the video from our next speaker about the mobile creches in India. This is a very impressive organisation that's been going for quite a long time, and they've certainly had an innovative approach.
We have to understand that the first 6 years of life, in the life of any human being, are most critical. Because while these are the most formative years, they are also the most vulnerable.
They are here for a very short period of time. There's a small window of opportunity, and we try to take advantage of that by providing an integrated program of nutrition, childcare, safety, protection, and some educational services.
Okay. We will also be having a slideshow of photography from one of the mobile creches centres in Delhi during the break, so please do take a look at it. And if you have questions about it afterwards, I'm sure we can try and deal with them. Our fourth speaker is Nikki van der Gaag, who's an independent consultant on childcare, and she's going to talk about the role of men in childcare and domestic life generally, and from the most positive point of view imaginable.
Thank you very much, Helen. I'm actually not a consultant on childcare specifically. It's more generally on gender.
Sorry,
so
yes,
I'm not
I'm
setting
reading my
myself
notes,
as a childcare
yes.
specialist here.
Okay.
So happy International Women's Day, everybody. Delighted to be here. I seem to be finding myself more and more often in the position of being a feminist, somebody who's worked on women's rights and girls' rights for very many years, talking about men. Always a bit weird. But the reason is that I feel that talking about men is one of the keys, not the only key, but one of the keys to gender equality. And I really welcome this report. The thorough research that you've done, the policy asks that you've got, it's fantastic. And it's great that you're also looking at the informal sector as well as the formal sector, because too often that's left out. It rightly points out that the idea of men as providers and women as carers is one of the drivers of the global childcare crisis. And I think there's a second reason, which you do mention, but perhaps is slightly underplayed in the report, and that is how much care work is undervalued in all its forms. I also think it's important not to isolate childcare from the other domestic work that's done. So very often the pictures we see of dads holding babies or going out, looking after their children, but they're generally not cleaning the toilets. So that part of it is also really important, as is elder care. I mean, I think increasingly women are looking after, the grandparents may be looking after the children, but they're often the women are also looking after their grandmothers, their fathers and mothers, as well as their own children. So what about men? I think there's still a tremendous scepticism that men can change. And there's not enough recognition, perhaps, that women too are some of the barriers to that change. I've mentioned already that while it's absolutely true that women do the bulk of the unpaid care, there are more fathers getting involved, mainly in the childcare work side of things. But I'm sure all of you have seen dads taking their children into work on the way in today, even. And the number of stay-at-home fathers is also increasing. But what I find in terms of childcare is that's often framed in terms of fathers or men helping. Let's help. It's not helping. We need to call for a sharing, not a helping, and to get rid of that word helping. So what can be done about it? As you've begun to do in this report, we need to frame this not just as a women's problem, but as a problem that society as a whole needs to address, from individual men and women to governments and the private sector. The new SDG target on unpaid care is a welcome step, I think, in that direction. More needs to be done to encourage men to take a share of unpaid work in the home. Research seems to show that when men are more involved in care work, they're more supportive of policies that support care work. I guess that's understandable. If you're doing the stuff, you know what the problems are. But as this report points out, this means starting young. The images research that's also in the report that I've been involved in finds that boys who see their fathers as well as their mothers involved in domestic work are much more likely to do the same thing themselves when they come to have children. So starting young, starting in schools, really, really important. There are a number of initiatives already, one in the UK. I'm glad to see two representatives from the Great Men Initiative here who work with schools here in Britain. There's another organisation called the Equal Community Foundation in India that works with young men on masculinities and changing role models. We need more of those kind of projects. With State of the World's Fathers, I'll wave it up here, we found that becoming a father, whether biological or not, and I think that's important because many men are involved with children who are not necessarily biological fathers, is either an entry point for change or it can make attitudes to gender more entrenched. So we need to make sure that we encourage the former through the kinds of policies you're talking about, but also I think through maternal and child health policies around involving men before, during and after birth, because that also there's also research showing that means that they are likely to be more involved later on. We need to campaign for non-transferable parental leave and fully paid paternity leave. I'll come back to that hopefully in the questions because it's a longer discussion than I've got right now. Finally, we need to support projects that question the men as provider, women as carer stereotype. And there are lots of examples of good projects that aim to change attitudes towards men and caregiving and men and gender equality. In Rwanda, we've talked about earlier on, there's a fantastic project run by an organisation called Ramrek, where the women are making dolls for the dads to get to practice what it's like to be a father. There's lovely pictures of these men with these little dolls, changing their nappies and things. I've just spoken at a conference in Russia where there's a lot of what they call papa schools. So it's people, again, talking to fathers about fatherhood, and the same in South Africa. And this means working with women as well. So all too often, I think we feel we're the best carers, we're the best ones looking after our children. There's something that we need to overcome ourselves there. So addressing the global childcare crisis will benefit children, it'll benefit women, and it'll benefit men, and it'll also benefit the economy. There's a recent report, I think came out yesterday from PricewaterhouseCoopers, talking about closing the gender pay gap, which still exists in every single country in the world. And it will boost female earnings in the UK alone by 80 billion, it says. So I hope this will be a catalyst for an excellent discussion today, but also for action tomorrow. And I'd like to just read out a quote from a book by a woman, Anne-Marie Slaughter. If you haven't read it, I think it's an excellent book about involving men in caregiving. And she's got a quote from Barack Obama, who says, "Everything else is unfulfilled if we fail at family, if we fail at that responsibility. I know that when I'm on my deathbed someday, I will not be thinking about any particular legislation I passed. I will not be thinking about a policy I promoted. I will not be thinking about the speech I gave, the Nobel Prize I received. I will be thinking about that walk that I took with my daughters. I'll be thinking about a lazy afternoon with my wife. I'll be thinking about sitting round the dinner table and seeing them happy and healthy and knowing that they were loved. And I'll be thinking about whether I did right by all of them." Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a lovely quote, isn't it? Okay, well, we've got half an hour allocated for discussion, so I do hope we can have lots of points raised, either arising out of what the panellists have said or other questions that are on your mind to do with childcare or to do with the report. And I'll also take questions in groups of 3 or 4. So could you please be very clear who you are? And I'm afraid really we want the questions and not the reflections this time. Okay. Well, can we start with those 3 over there?
Thank you very much, and happy Women's Day to all the panelists. My name is Antoinette Sala. My question is to Nicola. Has your research focused on childcare in the rural areas, in the countries that you've mentioned? How do women cope with childcare responsibilities?
In which areas?
In the rural areas. Rural, yeah.
Where did she say? Sorry?
Rural.
Oh, rural. Yes. Sorry. Okay.
Caroline Harper from ODI. All of the panel have worked on, childcare issues or had a long reflection on issues of gender and also on masculinity. And I just wanted to know whether over time you had seen change in the acceptability of speaking about childcare in public forums. Having worked on childcare issues for probably, well, not just childcare, but on children, gender issues for about 30 years. Certainly 20 years ago, I found it very difficult to go into a meeting with men, and would they take this seriously if you raised even the word children. So if you spoke about children, you just suddenly found yourself marginalised in a corner, whilst everyone else got on with the serious business. I'm detecting that it may be changing a bit, but I still think there's a sort of professional taboo about talking about children and childcare, and I just wanted the panel's reflection on that.
Hi, Rebecca Holmes from ODI. Thank you for a very interesting discussion from the panellists there. I wondered, Nicola, from your report, if you could reflect a bit more on what a sort of childcare sensitive social protection system might look like in practice, in terms of what kind of policies or what kind of design features would you be looking for, and also if you sort of mentioned about the links with informal and formal sector, the importance of childcare there. I wondered if you could just reflect a bit more of that as well. And I just had a couple of questions for Jenny as well, just also reflections You talked a lot about the conversation about the number of hours, about the kind of provision of childcare. I wondered if you could also just reflect on the quality of childcare and the importance of that in discussions at the moment. And also, not only looking at it from a childcare perspective, but also looking at flexible work arrangements. What are the kind of issues coming up about that?
Okay. Shall we start with Nicola then?
Sure, thank you. Yes, so we did, to answer your question about childcare in rural areas, we did look at that, and I think probably the Ethiopian case highlighted the concerns there the most. I think in terms of women demanding childcare services, it's still very fledgling. For women who are in public sector jobs, teachers, they realize that they needed to have access to childcare, but there isn't even a market for domestic workers. So often they're involving their own relatives in often quite exploitative situations. We talked, for example, to one girl who's now 10, but she started caring for her aunt, who's a teacher's infant, when the child was 1 year and when the girl herself was just 7 years. So she's in school, but juggling huge demands of infant care, unsupervised, unsupported. And that was just one of many stories we encountered. While there's a push now in Ethiopia to expand early child care in rural areas at very fast rates, they're trying to meet all of the global targets. At the moment, 50% of that need is being supported by so-called volunteers, so unpaid adolescents in their free time. So it's really, a huge crisis with no budget attached. So I think it's something that needs rapid attention. And the girls, who are supporting their parents, then they're suffering very much in terms of exam rates. So while the gender gap is closing in terms of girls' access to education, when you look at the 8th and 10th grade exam gender gap rates, it's more than 20%. So boys are passing at a rate of 50%, girls high 20s or 30%, even though in earlier years they were very much keeping up with their male peers. So it's a real crisis. In terms of Caroline's question about change over time, I think one of the things that sort of came through in this research was, while there's increased focus on childcare in the policy world, it seems to be very much focused on children's needs, but not thinking about what that means for mothers and the balancing act they will carry out. So the only example we came across where there was really attention on public service provision of childcare that was also considering women's needs was the Estancias subsidized creche program in Mexico, which is about what Jenny was talking about previously, about getting women into the labor market and supporting them to do that. Elsewhere, it's very much on school readiness and children being supported to have 2 or 3 hours of care a day, but that's in many cases is adding to the burden of women's time poverty and the absence of transportation and accessible services. And then Rebecca, in terms of your question about what does care-sensitive social protection look like, I think the programs that we found to be to be closest to approaching that, I think, although very far off, are the public works programs in South Africa, which are providing care. So women who are providing home care are then getting a public works stipend, so they're not doing busy work in terms of terracing or road construction. And there's now a pilot that we just learned about underway in Rwanda to start doing something similar in terms of women providing care for infants as well. But in terms of what we're recommending here, in terms of the multi-generational approach, looking at what do grandmothers need, what do adolescent girls, what do mothers need, I don't think there are global examples, and that's something I think we need to be advocating for and thinking about it, not just as an individual, but a generational approach.
Thank you. Jenny, would you like to?
Yeah, just first of all, a question about the acceptability of speaking about childcare. I think it is unrecognisable, really, compared to how it was 20 years ago. Childcare is almost seen now as a sort of core infrastructure element of society. I think it's something that we speak about a lot. We have long debates in Parliament about childcare. They're quite fierce debates. There's this sort of competing who cares the most, who's going to be the party of childcare. And that involves not just women MPs, but this involves male MPs too. The childcare minister is a man. And I think there are as many men speaking up for their constituents about the needs in terms of childcare as there are women. And I just think that is just the right thing, that is great. I still see, though, I think, in terms of who is most interested, who has to pick up the pieces when things fall apart, when the child is sick, who takes the day off. We know that is still generally a woman's primary responsibility in most households. And I think we have to get employers to see it as their responsibility too. But I think your question really is about direction of travel and about how far we have come in recent decades. And I just think we've come an awfully long way. And a lot of that will be thanks to some of the work that's gone on, probably by some of the people in this room. So I think we've just got to keep it up and keep the pressure on and keep it at the top of the agenda. On the question of quality, I think quality, again, has vastly improved. The professionalisation that we've seen in the childcare workforce has been impressive. The monitoring from Ofsted, now responsible for early years education, and the early years foundation stage that we would like to see preserved. The qualifications that the staff have to do now to work in early years settings is vastly different to how it was. My fear, though, I have to say, is that is starting to be eroded, and that the rate that the government pays for an hour of childcare does not actually meet the costs to providers, and the only way that they can make that match is either by vastly increasing charging for hours that are not paid for by the state, or by reducing costs. And reducing costs, as we know in other sectors, often results in reducing quality. So we need to keep a very, very close focus on quality to make sure that standards are maintained, and we don't go back to this idea that I think some colleagues sort of look back to fondly, this sort of mum's army being responsible for care in local neighbourhoods. I think that would be disastrous in terms of availability and quality. So, I think we've got to be very, very clear on quality, that we're not prepared to compromise in order to get greater availability or flexibility, that quality is equally as important.
Thank you. Nikki?
Just briefly on Caroline's, I think I would say yes and no, actually. There's still not enough men in this room as far as I'm concerned. I certainly remember when my kids were little, my partner was the only one working part-time, as I was, to have a day a week with the kids, and actually interviewed on the BBC because it was so exciting. That wouldn't happen anymore. But I think there's also a difference between talking about and doing. So that, there seems to be there is definitely more discussion. I think it's great, and it's being linked up with things like gender pay gaps and getting women into work. But what about the doing bit? I mean, there are still penalties for women, and I think for men as well, who take time off for a sick kid, or are seen as not serious about their jobs, because we're in an environment economically where there's more and more pressure on people to do long hours and things, particularly actually in this country, I think. So it's difficult for men to do that as well. So that, yes and no would be my answer, I think.
Okay, thank you. Shall we move on to the next batch of questions? Goodness, well, it's 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, okay.
Hi, my name is Caroline Nolan. I'm from the LSE. And I was wondering if you could comment, do you think the big issues are really around women's empowerment, or do you think they're around changing masculinities and an understanding of male social norms? Because as you see, there's lots of women here, But I just wonder, obviously it changes for different countries and obviously we need both, but with limited funding, where do you think the focus should be?
Over here?
Yes, sorry. I'll have a go.
Thank you. Helen O'Connell, independent freelance worker. I'd like to ask Nikki, but also the other panellists, their views on how to make paternal leave, or paternity leave, I should say, attractive and to increase the take-up, not just in Europe, but also elsewhere. Thank you.
Okay.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting discussion. My name is Claire Hickson. I'm from Womankind Worldwide. I wanted to ask the panel what they thought about the role of the private sector in this. We have a new target in the Sustainable Development Goals around unpaid care, but also an awful lot of interest in the role of the private sector in delivering those goals. So what more could companies be doing, either through their workforce, and then also in terms of thinking about their marketing budget and the amount that they invest in perpetuating the view that women are responsible for domestic work.
Thank you.
Hi, Rebecca Collins from The Great Initiative. I just want to pick up on something Nikki said about the role of women changing their attitudes and sort of behaviours around men as caregivers, and what they can practically do. And there are a lot of women in this room, and sometimes it's maybe controversial to say International Women's Day, but what could women be doing more to encourage and make it more of a social norm that men are caregivers, that they are sharing the load rather than just helping out or babysitting on the side when mum can't do it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Should we start the other end, Nikki?
Yeah, difficult questions. Okay, at the risk of being sort of seen as the Zen member of the panel, I'm going to say yes and no to your question again. I think we do need to balance both. I think it will be a disaster if we moved so much towards focusing on male social norms that we forgot about women's empowerment. We absolutely need to keep a focus on that. And with all these trends, there's always a danger that things go in one particular direction. I do think you need both. I don't think they're incompatible. I think you need work with women and girls, and you need work with men, and you need work with them together. And there are lots of projects out there doing that. So, yeah, my answer to that one would be both. Helen, the paternity leave things, we had endless discussions when we were putting together State of the World's Fathers reports. One of the things I thought was really interesting was that often paternity leave is only a few days, and men can up to a couple of weeks in many countries. In the Netherlands, where I half come from, it's still only gone up from 3 to 5 days, which is pretty shocking in a country that's meant to be, for women's empowerment and everything else. The thing that seems to have made a big difference, and again, I'm sorry to quote Sweden again, but Sweden had very good paternity leave, but it wasn't until it was a part of it was made non-transferable, i.e. if you don't take it, you lose it, that men really started taking it. So I think we need to look at that non-transferable element of paternity leave, and we also need to look at what was there done in the report, not just around birth, but for 6 children, etc., etc. And that's going to take much more than legislation, as I think Hella was saying earlier. It's also going to take a change in mindsets. I'll leave other people to talk a bit about the private sector, I think. And Rebecca's question about what can women be doing more, I think is different both depending on where you are in terms of country and where you are in terms of economic background as well. For me, the main thing is this business about I find myself doing it too, not thinking about him as helping, but thinking about the sharing. I was talking to somebody the other day who does research on fathers and mothers, and she was trying to look at that whole issue of who takes responsibility. So it's not just about what you do, it's about who actually thinks ahead, plans, takes responsibility, phones their mother to say, can you pick up the kids at the end of the day, or their father sometimes too. So I think it's really about changing our mindsets in terms of sharing that out. And in some countries that's really difficult because the home is the place where the woman has the power and not outside. So, I'm not saying this is an easy solution. I think we need to just keep discussing it. We need to look at, if women are going out to work, what does that mean for men? We need to make sure that men don't do all the talking and stepping in and, taking over as well. So it's a difficult balance, but I think there are things that we as women can do.
Okay, thank you. I wonder if I can just usurp or exploit my chair's privilege here and talk a little bit about the private sector, since you didn't really address that. You were talking about the private sector in terms of big companies providing for their workforce, which has all sorts of problems if women's jobs are tied to their childcare. But leaving that aside, in terms of the private sector, both in Europe, where I've looked at the issue quite broadly, and also in poorer countries, what happens with the private sector, relying on private sector care, is that it perpetuates inequalities, so that rich people pay for better care and poor people can only afford poor care. And, for example, those of you who've looked at the Defied Young Lives project, which is really a very important study, will be aware of the work of Martin Woodhead talking about the difficulties in relying on the private sector. So I think this is something we should really be aware of. It's an obvious default solution to let the market develop, but it does carry all sorts of problems and risks of its own. Right, having made my statement, Jenny, would you like to address some of the questions that have been...
Well, I mean, I find the debate around men and masculinity and the way that men are viewed, especially in their domestic role, fascinating, and I don't have an answer to it, but I do, observe the sort of comedy aspect of the whole thing. And that often, if you see a man engaged in childcare, either through sort of marketing or in the media, it's often getting it wrong, or it's, he's trying his best, isn't that lovely, or what a hero, or but isn't it a shame he's just given a 6-month-old baby a Kit Kat sort of thing. And it's, we've got to realise that actually men can be pretty flipping good at this stuff. And, I have had to go on this particular personal journey myself. And I think it's so deeply ingrained, this sort of angel of the hearth view of women, that it is very, very difficult to see how through just a government policy initiative we break free of it. And I think that the way that we do it is by, constantly keeping this debate going, acknowledging the added value that men can make to all of our lives and children's lives, and that the more people involved in supporting a child's early life, the better. And hopefully over time we'll start to see this change. But I don't have a government solution to this, because I just don't think there is one. I think it's just far too culturally embedded in every aspect of our lives for it to be as straightforward as that. I think on the private sector, I think one of the things we could do that I'm not aware that we do sufficiently at least is governments have got very big spending power when it comes to big contracts, working with big companies, perhaps in the energy industry, in construction, across the world. And sometimes they don't recognise that power in terms of being able to influence the contributions that those huge employers can make to issues of equality. Be that procurement from a particular region, employing local workers, or provision, perhaps we could be asking them more on provision of childcare and flexible working, and encouraging female progression in engineering or other occupations. So I think there's an opportunity there that government hasn't quite bent its head around yet. And that might be something that is worth looking at in the future. I think the issue of the only other thing I noted while Nikki was speaking was around this decision about who goes back to work and on what basis and paternity leave. And I think this is just so closely tied to equal pay. And if both parents earned the same, it would be a lot easier to share out that leave. And actually the grim reality of it is the one that earns the most goes back soonest. And usually, that is the man. And that has to change. And if we can crack that or start to see at least some improvement in that, then, I think you do start to see different decisions being made domestically too.
Thank you. Vicky?
Thanks. So on the question about how do you get men to take up paternity leave, I think we found the same kinds of challenges that unless it's mandatory, even with cash transfer programs where there's often conditions for parents to get involved in learning about early child raising, that unless it's, for example, with the 4Ps cash transfer program in the Philippines, until it was compulsory for men to turn up to some of the sessions, they just weren't coming. So it's seems to be a global phenomenon. But in terms of going back to your question about where should we be putting our resources, I think, yes, it's obviously critical we focus on changing social norms around masculinity, but at the same time there's also a huge amount of work to be done on women's empowerment. So for example, in the Ethiopian case study that we undertook, what our research highlighted there was that adolescent girls who are working as domestic workers have no rights. Even in the Constitution, they're not recognized as workers. They are given a term that's somewhere between servant and slave, and they have no labor protection whatsoever. And what we found there, that it's typically these adolescent girls who are shouldering the bulk of the infant care. So when you're new from a rural area, the least desirable job to take on in Ethiopia as a domestic worker is work with young children. If you're savvy and a bit more experienced as a domestic worker, you'll aim for a job where there's either no children in the household or at least there's no infants. So really recognizing the fragility of those adolescent girls who are doing so much of this unpaid work. And then the other group that emerged as particularly disempowered and really in need of urgent support were women carers with children with disabilities. So in the case study we did in Gaza, not only are women, because of social norms, often very excluded from the public space, but those mothers who had children with disabilities were often blamed for having brought those children into the world by their male relatives and extended families, and were particularly isolated without any support. And what they craved more than anything were support groups where they could talk about their common problems and at least share some of their experiences. So I think we've got to very much keep the focus on women's empowerment and support for women who are often caring for children and without any kind of resourcing.
Thank you. Yes. Intractable problems, they sound like. But hopefully we'll be able, as Helen was saying, together we can do much more to address these issues. Have we got time for a couple more last round of questions? People who haven't asked questions before. Okay, 1, 2, yeah.
Yes, hi, Sylvia Stefanoni, independent consultant working on aging issues. So I was really interested to hear about your connection and study on including older women and particularly grandmothers.
And grandpas.
But what I was interested in this proposal of looking at multi-generational social protection program, and I know you mentioned that you haven't seen any fantastic example you can point to, but is there a starting to think about what they might be looking like when we say multi-generational social protection program? What are we potentially envisioning? And the second really quick thing is around parenting, and this is a very I've been involved in a research in Moldova, for example, where grandparents, particularly grandmothers, felt also difficulties in taking all of a sudden a full parenting role, and very little support for that parenting role. So there were some interesting programs in Moldova developed after that. Have you seen any other programs that actually are looking at supporting grandparents in their parenting, so sometimes exclusive parenting role.
Thank you. One more question? Two more questions, sorry.
Good morning, my name is Kasia Staszewska and I'm from ActionAid, and thank you so much for a fascinating panel and the report. I'm so much looking forward to reading it. So you talked a lot about the norms, about gender norms, about the role of men, private sector, linking it to a gender pay gap and the role of women at work, but maybe something that I'm missing a little bit, I mean obviously it's not fair for the panel to address everything in such a short time, is maybe a link to the current macroeconomic policies really, and the revenue mobilization, public spending, you know, gender budgeting, all these sorts of things, also in terms of like analyzing where we are now, but also looking at the solution. So I would be really interested to learn about the panel views. How do we actually link and position the issue of childcare and care economy really in the macroeconomic debates, and whether you are optimistic about it, knowing that we're actually living in the times of austerity, and as we know, this is actually not really going to get any better anytime soon, unfortunately.
Hello, I'm Amna Khan. I'm a research officer at ODI. Based on the conversation I've heard so far, the way I've interpreted this is two distinct yet related processes that exist in countries in the developed and the developing world as progressive childcare and regressive childcare. And within progressive childcare is the elements of psychosocial and cognitive distortions and associations that get embedded over time. That can either have a vicious or a virtuous cycle, because the question that was mentioned here of the first 6 years of a child as formative and also the most vulnerable. So I wonder, what the panel thinks about the scale of a progressive childcare system and a regressive childcare system, and what is the first place we should begin with in terms of the cognitive elements of childcare.
Thank you. Okay, would you like to start, Jenny? You don't have to answer all the questions.
I'm totally terrified of that last question. I've got a psychology degree, and I don't know where to start with that. I mean, we don't want to harm any children, so I think, I don't know, I think probably somebody else should answer that one. On grandparents, I think we're just useless at supporting grandparents, and we actually put obstacles in the way of grandparents playing a full role. We don't support kinship carers well in this country, if at all. The benefit system disincentivises support by grandparents. Even if a grandparent happens to be a registered childminder, they are unable to include their grandchildren in the children that they care for. So I don't think we could get much worse, really, at enabling grandparents playing a full role. And I think that's one of the conversations that I want to have, just to understand better how we can do that. On the issue of resources, really, how you pay for it and how you make sure you get the best value for money. I think it's just all about priorities, and the government will find money for projects and initiatives and achieving goals for things that it thinks are a priority. And if it thinks that there's votes in it, bluntly, they'll stump up. And we've got to keep the needs of young children and parents at the absolute centre of the agenda. And we've got to use every opportunity that we can to do that, because if we don't, they will move on to something else and they will fund something else. We don't have a right to keep this central unless we keep fighting for it. And I just think there's already a mood to try and do more. We've got to make sure that the more that is done is effective, and that people take up that the system works for parents. The problem you've got at the moment is on resources. We're spending about £7 billion a year in England by the state supporting childcare. I don't think we get £7 billion worth of value out of that, because I think it's complicated, I think it's bureaucratic. we involve HMRC, we involve, different bits of applying for it in different arms of the state. I think it's inefficient, and we need to look at how we get the best value from what we already spend. And I think there is scope to spend more in this area by, taking it from other places. And, you can look at pension tax relief for higher rate taxpayers. You could look at, how we spend income, windfall income from bankers' bonuses and things like that. And I just think, given that childcare is now a national priority politically, we have every right to demand adequate resourcing of it.
Thank you. Okay, Nicola.
Just to build on the question about social protection for grandmothers. In the case studies that we looked at in East Asia, where it's primarily the grandparents who are taking care of the children of migrants, then I think a first step there is obviously to look at their household with the children as permanent dependents. So that's not happening. So many of these households are not recognized as poor, even though because of the care burden they're desperately poor. At the same time, you can then complement that with subsidized education for the children that they're caring for, and or make it easier for migrant parents to then have access to daycare and other services for their children. Many times they're excluded because social protection is tied to residency, of which many migrants miss out. So it's a huge concern. In terms of the budgeting question, I think that's something that as we push for a greater focus on unpaid care, then we need to make sure we are doing proper budget analyses. One of the things that I found deeply depressing was in Ethiopia, we've been talking so much about the great progress the country has made, how it was on track for many of the MDGs, and ODI actually put out a report about how it was one of the shining stars in Africa in terms of delivery on the MDGs. But then the excuse that's being used in the parliament is they've just tried to push through a recognition of domestic workers' rights is, we're too poor, we don't have the resources, we're not at that stage of development yet. So, very much contradictory depending on, as you were saying, where the priorities lie. So I think there's an urgent need to do budgeting in that regard. And also for donors to really look at this mass, rapid expansion of early childhood education, which is about school readiness, but not actually then looking at the cost to women in doing that. So I think it comes back to Caroline's concern earlier that, yes, women and children's rights can be very interlinked, but around childcare, they can often be in tension. So I think we've got to really face that head on, particularly in low-income countries, as we push towards the SDGs.
Yeah, the school readiness agenda is a very powerful one, and it's in a way quite shocking the way it excludes childcare.
Yes.
Okay, Nikki, any...
Very briefly, I know
yes.
we're kind of short on time. Grandparent support, I don't think there is nearly enough of it. I haven't come across very many programmes. I think it's really important and perhaps something that can kind of come out of this report. I'm also involved in the Young Lives project that you mentioned earlier, and one of the things there that we're finding is that often in very poor families, for example, children are being sent to live with aunts or uncles. So, I think it's also important to look at a more extended family, because not everybody lives in a nuclear family. Economic case, I think we need to make the economic case and to pick up where the research is being done, like the PricewaterhouseCoopers report I was mentioning earlier. We need to say this is for all kinds of reasons. There's social reasons, but we need economic support. And on the final question about the kind of progressive or aggressive childcare, again, Young Lives has been looking at, for example, in Peru, whether preschool childcare is just about daycare, leaving your kid and being able to work, or actually whether it's about developing cognitive skills. And there's some quite interesting research there looking at the differences between the two, and then the gendered differences between the two that I haven't got time to go into. So, okay.
Yes, well, thank you. I mean, I do think this issue about the continuum of understanding about quality of care, particularly from rich countries through to poor countries, needs a whole lot more addressing. I mean, what we consider to be marvellous care here is completely impossible except for the rich in poor countries. So what does that say about our standards? Anyhow, I do feel it's been a really useful discussion, and it shows not only how far we've come, but how far we still have to go to try and elucidate some of these issues and get them on the development agenda. So thank you very much to our panellists, and please show your appreciation.